Sergeant Jack Turner adjusted his helmet, the cold wind whipping across the war-torn landscape. The planet was no stranger to chaos, a battleground where countless battles had been fought for years. The enemy had been ruthless, and the local population, many of them alien species, had suffered under their rule. Jack's mission was simple: liberate the oppressed and bring justice where it was needed most. He moved quickly through the jungle, his squad behind him. Jack was part of a special unit sent to free enslaved beings, a task that never grew easier. Even after years of doing this job, seeing innocent creatures locked in chains, beaten, and forced to serve their captors, it still tore at his heart. But he was a soldier, and this was what he was trained for. "Sergeant, we got something up ahead," said his comrade, Private Davis, speaking over the comms. Jack nodded and gave the signal to move forward. They came upon a small, hidden camp near the edge of a thick forest. The stench of fear hung in the air, and the sight before them was almost too much to bear. Alien figures, bound in shackles, moved about like ghosts, working under the watchful eyes of heavily armed guards. The soldiers' faces were hardened, cruel, as they shouted commands in a language Jack couldn't understand. As Jack scanned the area, his eyes caught something that made his heart skip a beat. A young alien girl, no older than 20, was kneeling on the ground, her body bruised and covered in cuts. Her species was slender, with long arms and silvery skin that shimmered in the dim light. She had a regal look despite her broken appearance. Her face was delicate, but there was a hardness in her eyes. It was clear that she had been through unimaginable pain, but her spirit had not been fully crushed. Jack motioned to his team, signaling that they would make their move. They were here to rescue, not to wage an all-out battle. Quietly, they crept forward, staying hidden in the shadows. Jack knew they had only one chance to do this without being detected. "On my mark," Jack whispered, his voice low but steady. The team waited, their fingers ready on their weapons. Jack's heart raced as he focused on the guards. One wrong move, and everything would be lost. He took a deep breath and nodded. Now, in a flash, the team moved. They took out the guards with precision, using non-lethal force to knock them out. Jack quickly reached the alien girl, who had not yet noticed him approaching. She was staring at the ground, seemingly lost in thought, unaware of the danger around her. Her chains were heavy, and she struggled to move freely. Jack crouched beside her, his voice soft. "Hey, we're here to get you out of here." The girl startled, her eyes wide with fear. She tried to pull away from him, her instincts telling her to escape, but Jack's calm presence stopped her. He held up his hands in a peaceful gesture. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, his tone gentle. "I'm here to help." The girl hesitated, unsure if she could trust this human who had appeared from nowhere. Her entire life had been spent in servitude, under the command of cruel masters who had trained her to be submissive. But something in Jack's voice made her pause. Maybe it was the sincerity in his eyes, or maybe it was the way he spoke to her, as if she were a person and not a mere tool to be used. Slowly, she relaxed, allowing Jack to unlock the chains binding her. The metal clicked open, and she stood up, her knees trembling from weakness. Jack helped her to her feet, his strength steady and reassuring. "I'm Jack," he said, offering a hand. "What's your name?" The girl looked at him, her voice barely a whisper. "Lyra." Jack nodded, helping her to steady herself. "Lyra, you're free now. You don't have to go back to that life." Lyra looked around at the chaos unfolding around them. The guards were knocked out, and her fellow slaves were starting to run, taking the opportunity to flee. But her eyes lingered on Jack. She didn't understand what had just happened. Who was this human who had come to her rescue without hesitation? "You're sure?" I don't know what to do," she murmured, her voice shaking. Jack smiled gently. "I'll help you. You're not alone anymore. We'll figure this out together." He stood and helped Lyra move toward the nearby exit, keeping low to avoid detection. The teen was ready to leave, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. He had saved one life today, but he had no idea what the consequences would be. Still, he couldn't leave Lyra behind. Something about her made him want to protect her, even though he had no idea what he was getting into. As they moved through the jungle, the sound of their footsteps was the only noise breaking the silence. Jack felt a strange connection to Lyra, one he couldn't explain. He had rescued her, but she wasn't just a victim. There was a strength in her eyes, a fire that hadn't been extinguished. Jack knew that they would face challenges ahead, but for now, he focused on getting her to safety. He couldn't predict what the future held, but one thing was certain: he wasn't going to let her face it alone. The distance between the camp and their extraction point seemed endless. Lyra moved slowly beside him, still recovering from the physical and emotional scars of her captivity. But Jack remained by her side, every step driven by the promise of freedom and the hope that together they could build a better future. As they reached the rendezvous point, Jack turned to Lyra. "You're safe now. Let's get you to a place where you can heal, where you can be free." Lyra looked up at him, her eyes full of gratitude. She had been freed from her chains, but what she hadn't expected was the kindness she had found in the human who had saved her. Jack Turner kept his focus on the jungle path ahead as he walked alongside Lyra, the alien girl he had just rescued. His thoughts were racing. This mission was supposed to be about freeing the oppressed, but it had quickly turned into something far more personal. He had seen countless slaves before, but Lyra was different. She wasn't just another victim. There was something about her that made Jack feel like his world had shifted. Lyra was walking beside him, still weak from her captivity. Her steps were slow, cautious. Jack noticed how she looked around at the unfamiliar surroundings with a mixture of awe and fear. Everything about freedom seemed strange to her, like a dream that she wasn't sure she deserved. "You're doing great," Jack said, glancing at her. "We're almost there." Lyra gave a weak nod but didn't speak. Her long, silver hair swayed as she walked, and the bruises on her skin were visible under the dim light filtering through the trees. She was still trying to process everything that had just happened. One moment, she had been chained, working under the watchful eyes of cruel captors. The next, a human soldier had appeared out of nowhere, setting her free. But trust wasn't something Lyra was used to. The people who had enslaved her were ruthless, using her for their own purposes without a care for her well-being. Even the thought of being free felt like a distant concept, something she couldn't fully grasp. She had been taught to stay quiet, to obey, to never question her situation. And yet Jack had spoken to her like she mattered, like she was a person and not just a thing to be used. They moved deeper into the jungle, the air thick with humidity and the sound of distant animal calls. Jack didn't know where Lyra had come from, nor what her past had been like, but he wasn't about to leave her stranded in this place. His mission was clear: get her to safety. "You've never seen a place like this before, have you?" Jack asked, breaking the silence. Lyra shook her head, still unsure of how to respond. She had never known a world beyond the one of captivity. The trees, the sounds of birds and animals she had never heard, even the smell of fresh air, everything was so new to her. She had spent so long in chains, in a place where everything was controlled, that the idea of freedom was almost overwhelming. "Back where I come from, things are a bit simpler," Jack said, trying to ease the tension between them. "We don't have the whole space empire thing going on, but we do our best." Lyra glanced at him, still unsure whether she should trust his words. She had been tricked before, made to believe that things would change, only to find herself deeper in captivity. Her eyes drifted to the ground as they walked, her thoughts distant. Jack noticed her hesitation and slowed his pace. He didn't want to push her too hard, but he also didn't want her to feel alone. "I know it's a lot to take in. I'm not sure where you'll go from here, but I can help you find a place to start fresh." Lyra stopped walking and looked up at him, her silvery eyes searching his face. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why did you help me? I don't understand." Jack stopped too, facing her. For a moment, There was only silence. He wasn't sure how to explain it. What had made him risk everything to save this girl? It wasn't just his training. It wasn't just because she was an innocent life caught in a terrible situation. There was something more, something deeper. I guess I didn't want you to be treated like an object, Jack said slowly, trying to put his feelings into words. You deserve more than that. No one should live like that, no matter where they come from or what they've been through. Lyra's eyes softened, but doubt still clouded her expression. She had been treated as nothing more than a tool, an asset to be used. Could this human really mean what he said? Could he really want to help her without expecting something in return? Before she could respond, Jack heard a noise in the distance. His instincts kicked in, and he signaled for Lyra to stay quiet. They both crouched behind the thick brush, Jack's hand instinctively moving to the weapon at his side. His eyes scanned the surroundings, but the jungle remained still. After a few moments, he relaxed, his tense muscles loosening. False alarm, Jack whispered, but his voice still carried a trace of tension. He didn't trust the enemy not to be close. Lyra's eyes were wide with worry. She had never been out in the wild before, never felt the thrill of danger that seemed to follow humans like Jack. She hadn't realized how much danger she had been in just a few moments earlier, but now it was clear. This was a different world than the one she had known, one full of freedom, but also full of risks. Jack turned to her and gave a reassuring smile. We're safe for now, but we need to keep moving. Lyra nodded, though she still didn't fully understand why Jack was helping her. She had been abandoned so many times before by those who said they would protect her. The idea of trust felt alien to her, and yet there was something about Jack that made her feel like maybe, just maybe, she could believe again. As they moved forward, Jack kept a close watch on their surroundings. Every step brought them closer to the extraction point, where the transport ship would be waiting to take them to safety. But there was still a long road ahead. Jack had no idea what challenges lay in wait for them, but he was determined to get Lyra to a place where she could find peace. He had saved her once, but it was only the beginning of what would be a much longer journey. For the first time in a long while, Lyra felt something she hadn't in years: hope. She didn't know if it would last, but for now, it was enough. She was free. And maybe, just maybe, she could trust this human who had offered her something she had never thought possible: a chance at a life of her own. The jungle grew denser as Jack and Lyra continued their journey. The sounds of unfamiliar creatures echoed from the shadows, their calls loud and strange in the thick air. Jack kept his eyes sharp, watching every movement, while Lyra walked silently beside him. She was still adjusting to her new freedom, her steps hesitant, as though she was unsure if it was all real. Jack noticed the way Lyra kept looking over her shoulder, as if expecting someone to appear from the trees, to drag her back into captivity. He could feel the tension in the air, and he knew it wasn't just the jungle that made her uneasy. It was everything she had been through. Don't worry, Jack said gently, noticing her nervous glances. You're safe now. We're far from the slavers. Lyra looked at him, but her expression remained uncertain. She hadn't learned to trust easily, and the weight of her past was still heavy on her shoulders. How could she know if it was really over? How could she believe that Jack would not betray her like everyone else had? Jack understood her doubts. He had seen it before in soldiers and prisoners, people who had lost everything. But he also knew that trust was something that could be built, little by little. He wasn't going to force her to believe in him, but he was going to show her that he was there for her, no matter what. After walking for what felt like hours, they reached a clearing. Jack pointed toward a narrow path that led to a small camp nestled by a stream. That's where we'll rest for the night, he said. It's safe here. I've used this spot before. Lyra's eyes flickered with caution. Safe? How do you know? Jack smiled, the hint of a laugh in his voice. I've been on missions here before. No one comes through this area unless they know the land like I do. Still unsure, Lyra followed him to the camp. Jack quickly set up a small fire, the warm glow flickering in the night air. He pulled out some food rations and handed one to Lyra. She hesitated for a moment before taking it. The simple act of sharing a meal felt strange to her. It had been so long since she had been treated like this, like a person. "Go ahead, it's safe," Jack said again, offering her a reassuring smile. Lyra took a small bite, still unsure about the taste, but too hungry to resist. Her gaze wandered to the fire, the flames dancing in front of her. It was the first time in so long that she had felt this calm. Back in the slave camps, there had been no fire to warm her, no kindness to soothe her. She had been nothing more than a tool, used and forgotten when she was no longer needed. But here, with Jack, it was different. He didn't treat her like an object. He treated her like a person. "Why did you help me?" she asked, her voice low, almost hesitant. "You don't know me. You could have just left me there with the others." Jack paused for a moment, his hand resting on the side of the fire. "I couldn't leave you," he said simply. "It's not just about the mission. When I saw what they were doing to you, it didn't sit right with me. No one deserves to live like that." Lyra looked at him, her silvery eyes searching for any hint of dishonesty. But all she saw was sincerity. For the first time in a long time, she felt the stirrings of something inside her, a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, Jack wasn't like the others. I've never been treated like this before," Lyra admitted softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to trust." Jack nodded, understanding. "I get it, but you don't have to do it all at once. I'll give you time." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the crackling of the fire and the gentle flow of the stream nearby. The night was peaceful, yet there was an underlying tension that neither of them could shake. The world outside the safety of the camp was unpredictable, dangerous. They both knew that. As the fire burned down to a soft glow, Jack stood up and looked toward the horizon. "We need to leave at first light," he said, his tone serious. "It's a 2-day journey to the extraction point. We can't afford to waste any time." Lyra nodded, her mind racing. She had no idea what her future held. The idea of a new life, a life beyond the slavery she had known, felt almost too big to grasp. She had never imagined that someone would care about her, that she could be free. It felt like a dream. But Jack was real, and as much as she wanted to believe in him, she couldn't help but wonder if the dream would shatter once again. Jack caught the uncertain look on her face and approached her slowly. He knelt down beside her, his voice gentle. "I know it's hard. It's not easy to trust again after everything you've been through. But I'm here to help you. I promise." Lyra didn't answer right away. She simply looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. It was hard for her to let go of the past, hard to imagine a future where she wasn't constantly looking over her shoulder, afraid of being dragged back into the nightmare she had escaped. But maybe, just maybe, with Jack by her side, she could start to believe that she was more than her past. Maybe she could start to believe in a future. The fire flickered one last time before going out, leaving the camp in darkness. Jack stood up, his face set with determination. "Get some rest. We'll need all the strength we can get tomorrow." Lyra nodded, settling down near the fire pit. She closed her eyes, but sleep didn't come easily. Her mind was full of questions, full of fears she didn't yet understand. But there was something else too, a quiet hope that had started to grow in her heart. For the first time in a long time, Lyra felt like she might have a future. And maybe with Jack, she could finally find a way to embrace it. The morning sun rose over the jungle, casting its golden light through the dense trees. Jack woke up early, his instincts sharp as always. He glanced over at Lyra, who was still fast asleep, her face peaceful for the first time in what seemed like forever. Her posture was relaxed, but the faint shadow of worry remained in her eyes, even in her sleep. Jack couldn't blame her. It would take time for her to feel fully safe after everything she had been through. Jack packed up their gear quietly, not wanting to disturb her. He knew that today would be another long trek, but the extraction point was only a day away. If they could make it through the jungle without attracting attention, they would finally be safe. Lyra stirred in her sleep, her eyes fluttering open. She blinked a few times, trying to adjust to the bright morning light, then sat up with a small groan. Jack noticed her movements and walked over to her, offering a hand to help her stand up. "Morning," Jack said, his voice gentle. Lyra took his hand, her grip still hesitant. "Good morning," she replied, her voice softer than it had been before. There was a slight shift in her tone, something warmer than before. Jack smiled, but he didn't comment on it. He knew better than to rush her progress. "Ready to go?" he asked, already packing the last of their things. He had learned over the past few days that Lyra wasn't one for small talk, so he didn't push her. Lyra nodded, her eyes scanning the surroundings as she stood up. She didn't say anything at first, but Jack could see her scanning the trees, her sharp eyes looking for any danger. She was still on edge, still expecting someone to come after her. Jack couldn't blame her. After all, the slavers had kept her in a cage for so long that the idea of freedom felt alien. As they set off through the jungle, the heat of the day began to make the air feel thick and heavy. Jack kept his pace steady, knowing they had to move efficiently if they were going to make it to the extraction point. Lyra walked beside him, her movements cautious but determined. There was something different in her step today. She wasn't walking with the same fear she had had before. She was more confident, though Jack knew it would take time before she fully believed she was free. The jungle stretched for miles, and as they moved deeper into the wilderness, the sounds of the outside world faded into the background. The only noise now was the occasional call of a bird or the rustle of leaves underfoot. It was peaceful, in a way, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. "Do you ever feel like we're being followed?" Lyra asked suddenly, her voice a little tight. Jack looked at her, surprised by the question. "I've been keeping an eye out," he said, glancing around. "But no, I don't think we are." "Why do you ask?" Lyra didn't answer immediately. Instead, she kept her gaze fixed on the trees ahead. "It just feels like there's something out there, waiting." Jack frowned. He had been on enough missions to know that sometimes your instincts could be the best weapon. If Lyra felt that way, there was a chance they weren't alone. But he couldn't afford to let that slow them down. "I'll stay alert," he said, reassuring her, "but we need to keep moving." They continued walking, the weight of the jungle around them pressing in. Lyra seemed to relax a little, though her eyes still darted around every so often. Jack kept his pace steady, but inside, he was on high alert. The last thing they needed was to be ambushed so close to their goal. Around midday, they stopped for a quick rest by a stream. Jack used the opportunity to refill their water bottles, while Lyra sat on a rock, staring at the flowing water. She seemed lost in thought, her mind somewhere far away. Jack didn't interrupt. He had learned not to force conversation with her, especially when she was deep in her own thoughts. When he returned, Lyra was still sitting quietly. Jack handed her a water bottle, and she took it gratefully. "Thank you," she said, looking up at him for the first time in a while. There was something softer in her expression, a flicker of appreciation that hadn't been there before. Jack gave her a small smile. "No problem. We'll be at the extraction point soon, just a little further." Lyra nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I can't believe it's actually happening," she said quietly. "I never thought I'd be free. I thought I would die in that cage." The words hit Jack harder than he expected. He had never been a prisoner, never known what it felt like to lose everything and live in fear. But Lyra had, and hearing her speak so frankly about it made him more determined to get her to safety. "You're strong," he said, sitting down beside her. "You've been through hell, and you're still here. That takes a lot of strength." Lyra's eyes flickered toward him, a small, uncertain smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "I don't feel strong. I feel like I don't know who I am anymore." Jack leaned back against a tree, his eyes on the sky above them. "You'll figure it out. You don't have to have all the answers right now. You've been through a lot, and it's okay to not have everything figured out." There was a long silence between them as the sound of the water rushing by filled the air. Lyra didn't speak, but Jack could see that his words had reached her. She seemed to be thinking, processing the idea that she wasn't broken. That maybe, just maybe, she had a chance at a new life. After a few moments, Lyra stood up and looked at him. "Let's go. We still have a long way to go." Jack nodded, rising to his feet. He slung his pack over his shoulder and offered her a reassuring smile. "We're almost there." As they walked away from the stream, Jack couldn't help but feel a surge of hope. They still had obstacles ahead, but for the first time, he felt like they were truly moving toward something better, together. The dense jungle seemed to stretch endlessly before them, and the heat of the midday sun made the air feel thick and heavy. Sweat dripped down Jack's forehead as he scanned the area. He was tired, but he couldn't let himself relax. Not yet. They were so close to their extraction point, and nothing could stop him now. Lyra walked beside him, her steps steady but cautious. Her eyes never stopped moving, constantly looking for any danger. It wasn't paranoia. It was survival. Jack had learned to appreciate that level of awareness. She was no longer the frightened, broken slave she had been when he first found her. There was strength in her now, an edge that he hadn't seen before. She had adapted, learned to trust again, but it was clear that the scars of her past still lingered. "How are you holding up?" Jack asked, breaking the silence. His voice was gentle, but there was an underlying seriousness to it. Lyra glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. "I'm okay. Just tired." "You're doing great," Jack reassured her, giving her a small smile. "We'll be out of here soon, just a little longer." Lyra didn't respond immediately, but she gave him a small nod, her lips pressed together in a quiet agreement. Jack didn't push her. There were no words needed between them. They understood each other without having to speak. They continued their trek through the thick underbrush, the path narrowing as the jungle grew denser. Jack had to move carefully, guiding Lyra through the tangled mess of vines and trees. Every now and then, Lyra would reach out to steady herself on a nearby branch, her touch light but purposeful. Just as they passed a cluster of tall ferns, Jack's instincts flared. He froze, raising a hand to signal Lyra to stop. She immediately complied, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. Jack's hand went to the hilt of his knife, the sharp steel gleaming under the sunlight. "Stay quiet," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Lyra nodded, her eyes searching the surroundings. Jack had never been one to act without reason, so when he moved, she trusted him completely. The forest was still, but it wasn't the peaceful stillness of nature. It was an unnatural quiet, the kind that came before danger. A low growl broke the silence. Jack's heart skipped a beat as the sound echoed through the jungle. Lyra's eyes widened, and her breath quickened. The growl came again, closer this time. Jack had heard that sound before. It was the unmistakable warning of a predator. They weren't alone anymore. Before Jack could make a move, something large and fast darted out from the trees. A creature, covered in dark fur, lunged at them with surprising speed. Its eyes gleamed with hunger, and its sharp teeth were bared in a terrifying snarl. Jack had no time to think. He reacted instinctively. He shoved Lyra behind him, his body a shield as he grabbed his knife. The creature was on them in an instant, its claws slashing through the air. Jack blocked the first strike, barely managing to deflect the creature's claws with his knife. The creature howled in frustration, stepping back for a moment before lunging again, more vicious this time. Jack's mind raced. He had fought off hostile creatures before, but this one was bigger, stronger, and faster than anything he'd encountered. The jungle around them seemed to come alive with the sounds of the creature's growls and the rustling of leaves. Lyra gasped behind him, but Jack couldn't afford to focus on her. His attention was locked on the creature. He sidestepped its next attack, narrowly avoiding the sharp claws that swiped at him. The creature was quick, and Jack knew he couldn't keep dodging forever. He needed to end this fight fast. With a burst of energy, Jack swung his knife in a wide arc, aiming for the creature's throat. The blade found its mark, slicing through the thick fur and skin. The creature let out a pained roar, stumbling backward as a stream of blood poured from its wound. It staggered, its movements growing sluggish. Jack didn't hesitate. He pressed the attack, rushing in and landing another blow, this time directly into the creature's side. It gave one last desperate cry before collapsing to the ground, dead. Jack stood over it, panting heavily. His heart was racing, his breath coming in sharp bursts as adrenaline surged through him. He wiped the sweat from his brow, his eyes still locked on the lifeless creature at his feet. He couldn't afford to relax just yet. He needed to make sure it was truly gone, that nothing else was lurking nearby. Lyra stepped up beside him, her face pale, but her expression was one of awe. She had seen the entire fight unfold, but Jack hadn't had time to think about how she might have felt during the attack. He turned to her, his voice low but steady. "Are you okay?" he asked. Lyra nodded, though her voice trembled as she spoke. "I'm fine. You saved us." Jack shook his head, not wanting to make a big deal out of it. "I'm just doing my job. But we need to keep moving. There could be more of them." Lyra hesitated for a moment, glancing back at the dead creature, and then met Jack's gaze. There was something different in her eyes now. Respect, maybe even a hint of admiration. "You're incredible." Jack gave a small, self-deprecating chuckle. "I'm not invincible, just experienced. And I've learned to never underestimate the dangers out here." Lyra didn't say anything else, but the silence between them felt more comfortable now. They had faced danger together and survived. Jack could see the change in her. She wasn't just the girl he had freed from slavery anymore. She was his partner in this, someone who could hold her own. With the immediate threat neutralized, they pressed on. The extraction point was within reach. But Jack couldn't shake the feeling that this wouldn't be their last challenge. There was more ahead. More danger, more obstacles. But no matter what came next, he knew they would face it together. The jungle stretched out before them, its vastness almost overwhelming. Jack felt a strange sense of urgency now, an anxiety gnawing at the back of his mind. They were so close to their extraction point. He could already picture the transport ships in his mind. Safety, freedom, and a return to the world they had both been fighting to escape. But the jungle had a way of holding onto its secrets, and Jack wasn't convinced they were completely out of danger yet. Lyra walked quietly beside him, her steps steady and determined. Jack could feel her presence without having to look. She had grown so much since he first met her. She was no longer the frightened, broken soul that had been chained by her past. Lyra was stronger now, her body and mind sharper than ever. "You okay?" Jack asked, glancing at her. Lyra didn't reply immediately, but her eyes met his. There was a quiet strength in her gaze. She was holding it together, just as she had been since the moment he rescued her. "I'm fine," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I'm ready." Jack nodded. "Just a little longer. We're almost there." Despite her reassurances, Jack could tell that Lyra was exhausted. The physical toll of the journey was evident in the way she moved. Her clothes were torn and dirt-streaked, and her once pristine appearance had faded into a warrior's look. But there was still fire in her eyes. She wasn't going to quit. The sun was beginning to dip low in the sky, casting long shadows through the thick trees. Jack glanced up, taking in the changing light. It was a sign that they didn't have much time left to reach the extraction point. The darkness would only make it harder to navigate. Suddenly, Jack stopped, his hand raised. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end. His senses screamed danger. He didn't need to say a word. Lyra had already caught the tension in the air. She was alert, her eyes darting to the surrounding trees. Jack turned slowly, his hand instinctively going to the sidearm holstered at his waist. His heart raced as he scanned the area, his instincts on high alert. "They're coming," Jack muttered under his breath. Lyra's eyes widened, and she immediately moved closer to him, her body instinctively ready for whatever threat was coming. Jack's pulse quickened as he strained to listen. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the trees, moving closer with each passing second. "Get down," Jack hissed. In an instant, they both dropped to the ground, hiding in the thick brush. Jack's mind raced as he tried to figure out what they were dealing with. He could hear the footsteps clearly now, heavy and deliberate. There were more than one. Jack's hand moved to his weapon, preparing himself for whatever came next. He had fought many battles, but something told him this would be different. He needed to protect Lyra. He had promised her that he would get her out of this jungle, and he wasn't going to fail her now. A figure emerged from the trees, its shape hulking and large. Jack's eyes narrowed as he recognized the figure. It was one of the mercenaries, the group of hostile soldiers he had been running from since the beginning. They were closing in on their position, and Jack knew that they wouldn't hesitate to attack. The mercenary stood still, his rifle raised and scanning the area. Jack's grip tightened on his knife as he prepared for the worst. "We can't stay here," Lyra whispered, her voice low and urgent. Jack nodded. He knew that hiding wouldn't be enough. They needed to move, and fast. The mercenary was getting closer, and Jack couldn't risk them being discovered. As quietly as possible, Jack and Lyra began to move, crawling through the underbrush, staying low to the ground. Every movement was calculated, every breath controlled. Jack's mind was focused, but a part of him couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. They made it several yards forward, but just as Jack thought they might have a chance to escape, the mercenary turned, his eyes locking onto their hiding place. "Found you," the mercenary growled. In an instant, the situation escalated. The mercenary raised his weapon, aiming directly at them. Jack's heart raced. There was no time to think. He dove to the side, pulling Lyra with him. The air was filled with the sharp crack of gunfire as the first round ricocheted off a tree near them. Jack landed hard on the ground, his body taking the brunt of the impact. He quickly pushed himself up, pulling Lyra to her feet. The mercenary was closing in, his rifle aimed at them. Jack had only seconds to act. "Lyra, get down," Jack shouted. Without hesitation, Lyra dropped to the ground, instinctively rolling to the side. Jack's heart pounded as he sprinted toward the mercenary. He had no weapon to fight back, but he had speed and determination on his side. With a surge of adrenaline, Jack tackled the mercenary to the ground, knocking the rifle from his hands. They struggled on the ground, fists flying as Jack fought to gain the upper hand. The mercenary was strong, but Jack was fueled by desperation. He had to protect Lyra. He couldn't let anything happen to her. In a final burst of strength, Jack managed to land a punch that knocked the mercenary unconscious. Panting heavily, Jack scrambled to his feet, his eyes scanning the area. The immediate threat was neutralized, but Jack knew they weren't out of danger yet. Lyra slowly got to her feet, her eyes wide with disbelief. You did it." Jack didn't answer immediately. He was too focused on the task ahead. They couldn't afford to stop now. They had to get to the extraction point. With the mercenary down, they had a brief moment of respite, but Jack's mind was already on the next challenge. "Let's go," he said, his voice steady, though his body was aching from the fight. "We're almost there." They moved quickly, the extraction point now just within reach. But even as Jack pushed forward, he couldn't shake the feeling that something more was waiting for them. The extraction point was in sight. Jack could see the flicker of lights in the distance, the shape of the transport ship cutting through the darkness. They were so close, but he knew that the jungle wasn't done with them yet. Every step, every breath, felt like it might be their last. Lyra was beside him, her breathing steady, her eyes locked on the path ahead. They had been through so much together, and now it all came down to this final stretch. The mercenaries had been left behind, but Jack wasn't foolish enough to think they were truly safe. The jungle was filled with hidden dangers, and the only thing that mattered now was getting to that ship. "Almost there," Jack said quietly, glancing at Lyra. "Keep going." Lyra didn't answer, but she gave him a small nod, her determination clear. She was a different person from the one he had rescued weeks ago. She had learned to fight, to survive. And somehow, she had learned to trust him, just as he had come to trust her. They moved through the dense jungle, their steps light but hurried. Jack's heart was racing, but his mind was focused. The extraction point was less than a mile away, but every sound in the jungle seemed to echo with danger. Suddenly, the faintest rustle of leaves made Jack freeze. His senses screamed at him to be still. His eyes darted around, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. He motioned for Lyra to stop and crouch low, pulling her into the shadow of a nearby tree. Jack's pulse quickened. He could feel the sweat forming on his brow. His eyes scanned the area carefully, every sense alert. The slightest movement could mean trouble. Then he saw it. A dark shape, barely visible through the underbrush, moving toward them. The mercenaries weren't done yet. "Stay low," Jack whispered to Lyra. "We need to move fast." Lyra nodded, her expression unreadable but focused. Jack knew she was just as tired as he was, but she was strong. He could see it in the way she held herself. She wasn't going to let fear stop her. They began to move again, this time more cautiously, taking care to stay out of sight. The mercenaries were getting closer, but Jack wasn't going to let them catch them now. Not when they were so close to safety. The air was thick with tension, every sound making Jack's heart skip a beat. He didn't dare look back. Every second felt like an eternity. He focused on the path ahead, his mind running through every possible scenario. The mercenaries could be anywhere. They could have backup. They could be waiting to trap them. Jack's eyes scanned the jungle again. A flicker of movement caught his eye, and he spun around. A figure was standing in the clearing behind them. A mercenary. There was no time for hesitation. "Run," Jack shouted. Lyra didn't need any more encouragement. She bolted ahead, her legs carrying her faster than Jack thought possible. Jack followed close behind, every muscle in his body screaming in protest as he pushed himself harder. They were almost there, just a little further. Gunfire rang out behind them. Jack felt the heat of the bullets whiz past, too close for comfort. The mercenaries were shooting at them, but Jack didn't dare stop. He had to keep moving. He had to get Lyra to safety. The extraction point was only a few hundred yards away now, but it felt like miles. Jack's breathing was labored, and his vision was starting to blur from exhaustion. He didn't care. They had come too far to stop now. As they neared the clearing where the ship was waiting, Jack could see the silhouette of the transport hovering just above the ground. The ramp was down, and a few soldiers were waiting for them. They were almost home. But just as Jack thought they were safe, a shout rang out behind them. One of the mercenaries had caught up. He was close, too close. "Run, Lyra," Jack shouted again, not stopping to look back. Lyra was already ahead of him, but Jack could hear the sound of the mercenaries' footsteps getting closer. His legs were beginning to give out, but he couldn't stop. Not now. Just as the mercenary reached out to grab him, Jack turned around with the last of his strength. He tackled the mercenary to the ground, landing hard on top of him. There was no time for a fight. Jack had to get this done quickly. With a desperate, adrenaline-fueled movement, Jack disarmed the mercenary, pinning him down with his knee. He barely registered the sound of a gunshot, just a blur of noise and heat. But then the mercenary went still. Jack breathed a sigh of relief, but there was no time to waste. "Lyra," Jack shouted, "get to the ship." Lyra was already halfway to the transport, but she turned when she heard him. Her eyes locked onto his, her expression filled with a mix of fear and determination. She wasn't leaving without him. But Jack knew there was no time. He had done everything he could. He pushed her forward, urging her to the ship. "Go. Now." Lyra hesitated for only a moment before running the rest of the way. The ship's engines roared to life, the ramp beginning to rise as Lyra climbed aboard. Jack could feel the last of his energy slipping away, but he didn't stop until he was certain she was safe. Finally, with the last of his strength, Jack sprinted toward the ship. The ramp closed behind him as the ship lifted off the ground, leaving the jungle and the mercenaries far below. They had made it. They were free. Lyra looked over at Jack, her eyes filled with gratitude and something more. She had come so far, and so had he. Together, they had survived. And together, they were going to find a new future.